that out of the way, man, let's go ahead and dive into our Week 13 must-start running back plays of the week. The floor is yours, Kev. Go ahead and kick us off here with your first play.
Yeah, I'm going to start off straight to the top, coming hot. It's going to be Chase Brown. I mean, since taking over as the bell cow back for the Bengals, he's handling 84% of the snaps, 86% of the rush attempts, which is the highest rate in the league over that span. 61% of routes, 16% target share, and leads all running backs in expected fantasy points. He is the RB3 overall, averaging 23 fantasy points per game. If healthy, I think an absolute league winner with that workload. On paper, this looks like it could be a little bit tougher of a matchup. On paper, this looks like it could be a little bit tougher of a matchup, but they have really started stumbling since week 7. The Pittsburgh Steelers, they have allowed a 4.4 yards per carry, which is the 11th highest rate in the league. They've allowed the 3rd most rushing touchdowns, the 11th highest explosive run rate allowed, the 8th lowest stuff rate, and a 2.36 yards before contact per attempt, which is the 3rd highest rate in the league since week 7. So this matchup certainly isn't as difficult as it used to be. And I will also say he's had some really tough matchups before that he's come through on. Against the Ravens, that was definitely one of the tougher matchups he's seen against one of the elite run defenses. He did really well in that matchup. He did good against the Chargers, who are also really good against the run. So he's gotten to the point where he's pretty much independent of any matchup that he has because of the incredible workload that he has, because of involvement in the passing game. So Chase Brown is an absolute baller, and to me, he is a locked-in top 10 running back rest of season. I don't think that's hot whatsoever, and I am not worried whatsoever about this matchup against the Steelers.
Yeah, the receiving usage has been particularly surprising, just because we haven't really seen the Bengals do that over the past couple of years. We were always complaining that Joe Mixon was not getting that type of usage, and now Chase Brown is seeing what we thought Joe Mixon should have been seeing, and he is definitely taking advantage of it. Speaking of Joe Mixon, actually, and at the risk for sounding like this is an obvious spot, I did just want to mention Joe Mixon as a play of the week, just because I think is one of the best bounce back spots we could possibly ask for. Really, he should be giving thanks for this matchup at the dinner table on Thursday, going up against the Jags, who've allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game on the year. Mixon is coming off by far his worst fantasy outing of the season, not including week 2 where he got hurt. But even then, this past week, he still had elite usage with 20 total opportunities. Last week was the first time since week 6, which was his first week back from injury, that he didn't log at least 20 carries. And just to really drive home the point of the insane usage that he's been seeing, there have only been 2 games all year where he has not seen at least 24 total opportunities. Did just want to throw out Mixon, like I said, because he is my RB1 on the week, and I think we see him get back on track with 100-plus rushing yards and multiple scores in Week 13. And then the other obvious one I just want to toss out real quickly, not really talk about, though, is going to be Kyren Williams. I think he's in for a massive bounce-back spot. I was a little surprised to see that he has not put up a RB1 week since Week 8, but I think that changes here.
Yeah, absolutely love that call. Great matchup altogether. And I will say, not that it matters necessarily for this, but it does sound like Trevor Lawrence is supposed to be back as well for that game. So I think push the game script a little bit along. But let's keep moving here. I'll move over to my next guy, and I'm going to hit on Kenneth Walker. Since week 9, Walker has really taken over as the true workhorse running back for this team. The last 4 weeks, Walker has played 72% of the snaps, 68% of the rush attempts with an 11% target share. He's averaging about 14 carries, 4 receptions per game. He's 14th in yards after contact per attempt, 9th in elusive rating, and 26th in yards per route run. And he's averaging about 13.6 fantasy points per game. Now, I will say a couple of the matchups they have been pretty tough. Honestly, Arizona has actually been one of the best run defenses in the league since week 7. They are only allowing about 80 rushing yards per game to the position. So I think a couple of these matchups here, maybe we should have expected this a little bit with Kenneth Walker. But that changes this week with matchups against the Jets here. The Jets have really started to struggle against the run. The 10th most rushing yards, the most rushing touchdowns, and 12th in yards after contact per attempt over the last 4 weeks they've played. So I do think this is a much better matchup for Kenneth Walker. And honestly, this Jets team is an absolute disaster right now. I mean, everything that's coming out about this team right now is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with Aaron Rodgers. We talk about maybe placing him on IR, that they're going to move on from him after the season. They're going to clean house. Like, it has just gotten bad to worse to worse. I mean, it is a tough scene to be any New York fan, whether you're a fan of the Giants, whether you're a fan of the Jets. I mean, both these teams are just absolute dumpster fires right now. So I wouldn't be surprised if this Jets team just completely implodes. So I really do like Kenneth Walker a lot this week. I think he bounces back and he's in for one of those big monster games that we've seen early in the season.
Yeah, it feels like it's been a minute since we've had one of those, but I love that call with Walker this week. Definitely would have been somebody I would have talked about had you not already state claim to him. But my second play of the week is going to be Aaron Jones. And after we saw 2 weeks of decreased usage, kind of in quotes, and snap rates for Aaron Jones after he was dealing with that rib injury, we saw him rebound, get back to that workhorse role that we had gotten used to for the majority of the year. In week 12, Jones saw 26 total opportunities and 79% of the snaps to just 4 opportunities and 15% of the snaps for Cam Akers. The Cardinals defense has been better than what the overwhelming majority of us thought it was going to be heading into the season, but they're still allowing the 12th most fantasy points per game to running backs. They've only given up 9 total touchdowns to running backs, makes their points against numbers look better, but they're allowing nearly 144 total yards per game to running backs through the air and on the ground. They've allowed the 11th most rushing yards in total on the season, the 8th most receiving yards to opposing backs, and early betting lines have Minnesota favored by 3.5. I think we see that number creep up toward the end of the week, but I love this spot as a potential smash spot for Aaron Jones.
That's how he's going to have to get there because, like I've said, because on the ground, they really have. I mean, like I said, since week 7, they have only allowed 3.7 yards per carry. And only 84 rushing yards per game over that span. And this blew me away. Their explosive run rate allowed is 0.9%. The next closest is the Patriots, who allow a 2%. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but they are allowing no explosive plays whatsoever, which aligns with the fact that they have the second highest stuff rate in the league over that span, and they're about middle of the road in terms of yards for contact per attempt. But where they do struggle, and just like you mentioned, is against pass catching running backs, because they've allowed nearly 500 receiving yards this year to pass catching running backs. So that is really the area where you can attack them. And obviously, you're not worried about that with Aaron Jones. Next up for me is going to be Bucky Irving, and I had him on the list last week. And you know what? I said, fuck it, we're going to put him on the list again this week because he was phenomenal last week, and it really was kind of his coming out show. Handled 54% of the snaps, 18 total opportunities, and scored 27 PPR points on the season. He's now the RB24 in fantasy points per game, and the dude's just been incredibly efficient. His 7.4% explosive run rate ranks 3rd, trailing only Jahmyr Gibbs and Derrick Henry. He's 3rd missed tackles forced per attempt, which trails only Kenneth Walker and James Conner. And he's 3rd in yards after contact per attempt, and he's 11th in yards per route run. He pretty much checks every single box that you're looking for. And honestly, it does get frustrating at times when Rachaad White's even involved because it feels like he should just be the workhorse for this team. I get it with his size. Maybe you're not asked to do all that, but Rachaad White's never going to go anywhere because they really like him on 3rd downs. They really like him, as a pass protector on 3rd downs. That's not something that they've really wanted to ask Bucky Irving to do. They do get another really good matchup this week against Carolina. Since week 8, the Panthers have allowed 157 rushing yards per game, 1 touchdown per game. Their 31% stuff rank is dead last, and their 2.11 yards before contact per attempt is also the 7th highest rate in the league. So this is still a very good matchup for a running back, and I think this is another one that Bucky Irving is going to exploit. Even though that he's only handling limited opportunities, he's still very involved in the passing game, so that is also a positive for Bucky Irving.
Something I was surprised to see from that game on Sunday too was the fact that Bucky Irving ran more routes than Rachaad White did. He obviously out-targeted him 6-1. They split carries at 12 apiece, but Bucky ran 20 routes to just 11 for Rachaad White. So if that can continue for the rest of the season, that's going to be a big feather in the cap for Bucky going forward. Moving on, I'm going to talk about Tony Pollard. I mentioned Joe Mixon as someone who should be giving thanks for his Week 13 matchup. Tony Pollard should be right there next to him. Pollard played extremely well this past week in a difficult matchup against the Texans, but even in the 2 weeks before that, he went up against the Chargers and the Vikings, and all 3 of those teams have been among the toughest fantasy matchups for running backs. And Pollard now is going to get to go up against the Commanders, who've allowed the most rushing yards on the season. They are tied for the 5th most rushing touchdowns allowed. They've done really well against receiving backs, but that's not necessarily something I'm worried about here in this matchup. I'm assuming that Tyjae Spears is going to be back for this one. That doesn't really bother me. He's averaging about 8.5 opportunities per game, which includes a 15-carry outlier game back in week 4. So I don't think that we should necessarily be counting on, another 24 rush attempts from Tony Pollard this week, but I don't think it's going to be too far out from that either. So love this spot for Tony Pollard. It's good to see him kind of rebound from where he was last year when, I know especially you, Kev, you're all about that Tony Pollard life, but we just did not take into consideration just that injury that he suffered, really holding him back for another year. But he's definitely rebounded from that now. So good to see that from TP.
So next up, I'm going to talk about Tyrone Tracy, and I get it's probably a little bit of a touchy subject this week for some people, especially people that rostered him and played him this week, because I think it really could have been a pretty solid game for him because he looked like the guy that we expect, right? On 9 carries, 4 receptions, he had 70 total yards. It was looking great for him. Now the game script wasn't going great because they were getting the boat raised, but he did it again. Oops, he did it again, like Britney Spears said. He fumbled. And I was like, as soon as it happened, I was like, oh, God, here we go.
Yeah.
And because it's 2 weeks in a row, the game wasn't like it was close or like it was like, it was coming down or like it was like it was the last time where it cost him the game. But still, so then right after that, he got benched. The very next series, they were able to move the ball down the field again. And of course, they got to the 1 yard line and they scored a touchdown, and Devin Singletary took it. So then they ended up putting him in like ultra garbage time. Last drive of the game, 2-minute drive. Game was completely out of hand. Some of the starters were pulled, and they put him back out there. And so he ended up getting a couple more receptions, which kind of helped people a little bit to make it not such a just a god awful day for him. I think he finished like 9 fantasy points, but I'm going to go right back to the well. Like he is clearly their best running back. If you look at every single metric, he just completely dwarfs everybody else on that team in terms of their other running backs. Eric Gray's not it. Devin Singletary's not it. Tyrone Tracy definitely is. Now there is a case to be made that, if you can't hold on the ball, head coaches aren't going to like that. And so that is definitely a problem. But I don't think this is a long-term issue with him. And this is honestly a great matchup. Now, last week, there should have been some expectation that, they could get their ass kicked, especially with Tommy DeVito going against the Bucs. Like, that offense has been really good all year. You were going to need their defense to play one hell of a game to be able to limit that. This week, we're not as concerned about that with Cooper Rush out here. I know that team put up 34 points last week. That was on a lot of fluky stuff. The kick return for a touchdown, a defensive touchdown. I mean, a lot of different things happen in that. I'm not so worried about that this week. And so the Cowboys have been really, really bad against running backs as well. Like we just, since week 7, the Cowboys have allowed a 5.17 yards per carry and over 2 rushing touchdowns per game. Over that span, they've also allowed the 2nd highest explosive run rate, the 7th lowest stuff rate, and a 2.4 yards before contact per attempt is the 3rd highest rate in the league. So this is a tremendous matchup for Tyrone Tracy. I think he'll be fine. I think he's going to continue to operate as his team's lead back. Obviously, his team's not going anywhere this year, so I don't think that should be taken into consideration. So I think putting him out there, trying to build his confidence back up, I definitely think is the way to go. And this could be an absolute smash matchup for Tyrone Tracy. So I think he bounces back in a big way. I'm going to go right back to the well, and I feel pretty confident about it.
Yeah, again, we've said this a couple of times, but he was someone who I was also debating on talking about. So I'm right there with you. And even with the Cowboys defense getting healthier, they weren't good against the run earlier in the year whenever they did have all their guys on defense either. So even with Parsons coming back and getting a couple of their other pieces, that's not going to matter too much to me. So really like that spot. Lastly, Chuba Hubbard. The Panthers are actually not awful to watch, which is something we couldn't say for like the first half of the season. Kev, you're talking about Bryce Young looking better and at least a functional quarterback earlier on. But even during that time when everything was so bad, Chuba Hubbard was still one of the most consistent fantasy running backs we had. Just saw him put up a back-end RB1 week in a really difficult matchup against the Chiefs. Now gets to go up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs on the season. Jonathan Brooks saw just 5 snaps last week, so while I think we should certainly expect him to be more involved in this second week, this is still Chuba's backfield. He's still going to be handling the overwhelming majority of these touches this week, and Hubbard has quietly also racked up 11 targets over the past 2 games. This is an area where the Tampa Bay Buccaneers really struggle. And they've allowed the 2nd most receiving yards to running backs this season. So I think this is another spot where we can continue to see Chuba put his efforts on full display.
you.